is alone in his presence. And I just want to keep you a few minutes on that theme. This whole month, we've been talking about that subject, alone in his presence. And the month began. Millie was the first. Millie Lopez was the first one to start the month off with the theme, and she gave a whole lot of advice, a whole lot of uh, great advice on how we can get alone in his presence and tools that we can use, books, devotionals. Um, she gave us a whole lot of things to work on. And yesterday, I tell you, the Pastora Tabitha Lopez came on and she talked about the different positions that we can take in God's presence as far as posture and um, the 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 positions of our body and how sometimes the urgency of our prayers. And that really touched me so much. That particular preaching, that particular teaching, it made me cry, it made me tear up, it made me really think about prayer a lot, because sometimes in our daily lives, when we serve the Lord, in our daily lives, sometimes we're so tired, so physically worn out, and so physically tired that we don't take the position of getting on our knees and getting alone in his presence. And for a Christian, it's essential. It's essential that we get into God's presence on a daily basis. It's not something that we do every once in a while. It's something that's essential for our growth, something that is essential for our life to to show fruit. And in order for us to have genuine change as a Christian, if we don't spend time alone with God, it's like we don't grow, we don't change, we stay the same, and we just don't move forward. In life, sometimes we have relationships that they're not, there's no difference as far as if you want a relationship to grow and you want to have a relationship with a partner, a person, a friend, a family member, and we don't spend time with them, we don't get to know them, there's no growth in that relationship. And that's no different from our relationship with God. And I was thinking yesterday when I was trying to, you know, during the week when I was trying to prepare for this, sometimes in our relationships, when we meet some, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but it's happened to me plenty of times, that we make an assumption when we get to know, when we know somebody. We are introduced to somebody and we see their facial expression, or we see something that they do, and we judge them with that act or with that facial expression, and we make an assumption and we say, oh, that person is like that. And then later on, when we become friends with them or we get to know them better, we realize, oh, wow, I made an assumption about this person and they were nothing like the assumption that I made. They're nothing like what I thought. The serious face that they had, and they turned out to be such a nice, chill person, um, such a nice character to that person, and I judged them wrong. And sometimes we judge somebody and we think they're a real nice, chill person, and then we get to know them and they turn out to be the opposite. And sometimes as Christians, we make those assumptions about God. We think that we know him and we make assumptions, and we think that he has to bless us because he's all powerful. And we think that he has to heal us because he's a healing God. And we think that because the Bible says that he shines his sun on the good and the bad, or he reigns on us all, we make these assumptions about the relationship that we should have with God. We think that he has to bless us because he's almighty, and I need a job and he has to give me a job because I serve him when I don't give. Or I think that he should bless me um, in any area when I don't spend time with him, when I don't get on my knees and I don't spend time with him. And This is one of the things that I got from all the messages that I heard this month, that sometimes we make assumptions about God and how he should have to bless us because he's all powerful. And he doesn't have to do anything. If we don't create a relationship with him, he doesn't have to do anything for us. But in his mercy, he does. He allows us to wake up every day and he allows us to go into his presence. Um, I heard a quote not that long ago, and it says, one moment in God's presence, one moment in the presence of God can change many things. Sometimes we don't spend time with God and things stay the same, but one moment in the presence of God can change many things. The great thing about God's presence is that we don't have to travel to be in his presence. Sometimes we have to travel to go see a friend. We don't have to travel to be in God's presence. All we have to do is get into the position of reverence to be in his presence. We don't have to go to another country. We don't have to do anything to be in his presence. Just get into that position. I want to speak about a character in the Bible, and I want to speak about Elijah. I don't know what you guys think about when you hear the name Elijah. I know that some of the people during the month did mention him, but I want to speak a little more in detail about Elijah. When we hear the name Elijah, we think great big things. Oh, Elijah the prophet. What comes to your mind when you think about Elijah, when the name Elijah comes out? Because what I think immediately is Elijah the prophet, the one that stopped rain, the one that brought the rain back after he mentioned that the rain was going to stop. He mentions also when the rain is going to come back. I think about the prophet that was on Mount Carmel that challenged Baal, the prophets of Baal, and he brought fire down on a sacrifice. I think about when he brought the widow's son back to life. I think about many things that he performed during his lifetime, but we don't think about the moments that God took him to be in Solence, when he took him to be in the quietness. So Elijah comes onto the scene right when King Ahab becomes king. In the book of First King, I want to read that. First Kings 16:29-33. I only want to read it because I want you to see what Elijah is coming to take on. What Elijah, when he comes on the scene, what he's coming to face. First King 16:29-33 says, in the 38th year of, there's a lot of big words in here, so please bear with me. And there's a lot of names in here, so bear with me and I'll get through this. First King 16:29-33 says, in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, the son of Omri, began to reign over Israel. And Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him. Can you imagine? He was the most evil so far in this time. And if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nabat, sorry about that, he took for wife Jezebel. Not only was he the most evil king to come onto the scene so far, he was worse than Jeroboam, which was very evil because not only was he an idolater, but he also brought the people into idolatry. He made stands for them so that they didn't go up to worship God in the temples or in the hills, he brought gods to them. So now Ahab was worse than Jeroboam, the Bible says. And to make it worse, he marries Jezebel. So not only does he have a king that's evil, the most evil, but he has a queen that's even more evil. This is when Elijah comes onto the scene. Elijah is a prophet that is going to face Ahab. So Elijah comes to the scene, and the first thing that the Lord tells him to do is to go to King Ahab and warn him, prophesy to him about the drought that's about to come over Israel. Elijah prophesies the drought and tells King Ahab, not only is it not going to rain, but it's not going to rain until I say that it rains again. And then right after he gives this prophecy and this warning, I want you to know, before I get to say what I'm going to say next, I want you to know that that Elijah gives this warning to Ahab, but this is not something that God had not already said. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 11, 13, and I just want to set the scene. 11, 13, and 14 says, because this is something that the Lord had already established. It's not something new. The Lord had already mentioned this during the time of Moses. Deuteronomy 11, 13, and 14 says, this is what the Lord has said before. And if you will indeed obey my commandments that I will command you today, to love the Lord your God and serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, he will give you rain for your land in its season, in the right time when it's supposed to happen. The early rain and the later rain. And then in verse 14 it says, verse 15 says, and he will give grass to the fields and your livestock. So everything depends on the rain, the livestock and the field. And you shall eat and be full. But then he says in verse 16, we jump to verse 16 where it says, and take care lest your heart be deceived and you turn aside and serve other gods. So this is where Ahab is. And you serve other gods and worship them. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens. He will shut the heavens so that there will be no rain in the land. And the land will yield no fruit, and you will perish quickly. Of the good of the land and the Lord that the Lord has given you. So this is not something new that Elijah was telling Ahab. He was telling him, I'm here to tell you what the Lord has already established before. So he had a reference to what he was telling Ahab. If you worship other gods, if you love something above God, and this is relevant today. This is relevant for us today. If you put something ahead of God, if you put something before God, the Lord will close up the heavens. And he cannot reign and bless you if you're putting something ahead of, and he does. A lot of times in his mercy, he does bless us above, even though we're doing things that are not pleasing to him. But in this moment, he tells Ahab, if you put things ahead of me, because this is what Ahab did. Ahab not only rose a temple for Baal, you say in English, right? Baal. But he also he rose up a Asher pole. And he rose up idols so that he was to worship, him and Jezebel were to worship Baal. So the Lord was telling him, because you did this, and I have already established my word, I will not rain upon you. So a lot of people were paying for this because Ahab had established idols to worship. So this is the scene that Elijah comes onto. And the Lord tells him right after he gives the warning to Ahab that there was going to be, the heavens were going to be shut and there was not going to be any rain. He tells Elijah to hide himself. He tells Elijah, go hide yourself, because now that you've given this prophecy and now that you've given this word, now there's going to be problems. There's going to be, I said to myself, why hide? When I read the word of God and I hear that the Lord is telling Elijah, hide yourself, after he gives this big word and after he pronounces this and after he goes to this people, this evil people, and he gives them this warning, why does the Lord tell him to hide? Because the Lord could protect Elijah wherever he is. He could protect Elijah right in front of Ahab's face and Jezebel's face, but the Lord tells him and instructs him. And what I love about Elijah, and we learn so much from Elijah's life, in the moments even before he gets to the big things, because Elijah follows God's instructions to the T. The Lord tells him, go hide yourself by the brook of Kerith, and he does it. He does exactly what the Lord tells him to do. And not only does he follow instructions, number one, he also learns to wait on the Lord. Not only does he have to sit by a brook by himself, but he has to totally surrender to God and wait for his meals. Daily wait for a raven to come and bring him bread and meat. So Elijah follows instructions, but he also learns to depend on the Lord, and this time alone with the Lord. I don't know about you, but if you're a very independent person and you have to go and sit somewhere and depend on somebody, the way that Elijah had to depend on God for food, that's not an easy thing to do. Sitting there and waiting for your food to come and drinking from a brook. And Elijah does this day after day because the brook doesn't dry up right away. And the drought lasts 3.5 years. So for 3.5 years, Elijah has to sit, maybe not 3.5 years, but for a good period of time, Elijah has to sit by the brook by himself and depend on God. What kind of dependence is this? What can we learn from the dependence that Elijah has on the Lord at this moment? I read this book, and it's about the life of Elijah. And I want to tell you what this book tells me, that Elijah's life was during the time that he was sitting by the brook. And I want to read this piece of the book to you, only because it describes Elijah's life by when he's by the brook like a boot camp. The only person that I currently know that went through a boot camp is Gabriel, when he went to the Marines. And I remember us distinctly praying specifically for the time that he was going to be in boot camp, because he was going to have no communication with anyone during this boot camp. He had no phone. He couldn't communicate with his family. And this is what this book describes that Elijah's life was. So when this author gets to this boot camp, this is what he said his life was like. And this is what I could only imagine Elijah's life was like during this time. During the months that followed, every shred of self-sufficient arrogance, and I imagine that Elijah had to go through this because he's human. Just like any human, when the Lord uses us powerfully and we think that we're humble people, we fool ourselves by thinking that we're humble people and that it won't go to our head or it won't go to our heart. And we think that we'll be a humble person after the Lord uses us for something great. And the things that Elijah was about to step into, the acts that the Lord was going to use him to perform, this is the boot camp that he was about to go into. And this man describes it like this: during the following months, every shred of self-sufficient arrogance, every hint of an independent spirit, and all thought of rebellion was scraped away. Any indifference toward authority was replaced by a firm commitment to do only as we were told, regardless. We learn to survive in the crucible of intense extreme training. In the extreme training that has characterized the Marine Corps throughout this proud and proven history. The discipline regimen of a boot camp, day after day, week after week, brought about remarkable changes in each and every one of us. As a result, we left that place completely different than when we arrived. The isolation of our location, the absence of all creature comfort, and relentless monotonous drills, and the demanding repetitions, because I imagine that every day Elijah's life was the same, but he had to give up every self-sufficient arrogance, every hint of an independent spirit. If you're used to being independent and doing things for yourself, and you have to depend on somebody, like ask them to, you're a leader in church and you have to ask somebody to do something, but you see that they're a person of a calmness, that they take more time than you would normally do, it would drive you crazy to have to depend on somebody. And if you're a independent person and you fall sick, or you fall in a place where you have to totally depend on someone, it's not an easy thing to bend that, to put your will in somebody else's hands. And this is exactly what Elijah had to do. He had to sit and wait on God. He had to wait on his meals. He had to wait on the instructions. He had to wait on anything that the Lord wanted. He had to wait. There's another part here that says, and I'm almost going to end soon, but this gave me a description of what God's plan is always full of surprises and mystery. While we might have chosen to leave Elijah there confronting Ahab, that's not what the Lord chose for him. The Lord chose him to isolate him and work on his inner self, right? His inner life. Things that will prepare Elijah to encounter for encounters that might destroy a less obedient Christian, a less committed, a less prepared servant. Sometimes God has to bend our will. We don't always understand God's plan. Anyone that tells you, excuse me, anyone that tells you that they know God's will for their lives, everything that's coming forward for them, and everything that they're praying for, and they tell you that they know God's will for their life every minute of the day, is not being truthful. We don't know what God's will is for us all the time. And the only way to know God's will for us is to get into God's presence. Any self-sufficient arrogance that we may have, any independent spirit that we may have, can only be broken by spending time in God's boot camp. And this is what God did for Elijah. After Elijah left this place, this brook, when the brook dried up and the Lord told him to move forward, to move on, the things that Elijah accomplished Elijah goes from the brook, and the Lord gives him instructions that he's going to run into a widow. We already know that. And he prophesies that this woman's, the oil will never run from her house, will never leave her house. And one of the things that impressed me about Elijah's life was when he raised the widow's son to life. How could Elijah believe that the Lord was going to use him to raise somebody from the dead when there was no reference before that? When he prophesied to Ahab that there was not going to be any rain, this is something that he referenced because the Lord did reveal that to him, and he did go to Ahab, but he referenced it from Moses' times. The Lord has said that there will be no rain if you're worshiping idols. But where did Elijah read or get the concept that the Lord was going to use him to raise somebody to life when there was no reference before this? How could he know and trust God and believe in God that he would pray for this little boy and this little boy will come to life unless he had spent time in God's presence and the Lord revealed this to him? How could Elijah know that he was going to go to a mountain and challenge Baal's prophets, because there was a lot of prophets, and he was going to challenge them, and fire was going to come down and burn his sacrifice? Where was he referencing this from? There was nothing said about this before, unless Elijah got into God's presence. So these are the things that I learned from Elijah spending time alone with God. Elijah learned to pray God's will. And this is something that we need to do. Learn to pray God's will over our lives, because when we don't submit our will in God's presence and our will is ahead of God's, and we don't learn to bend our will and we don't learn to pray God's will, we stay the same. We stay the same. Elijah learned to pray God's will. He gave his desires to God, he gave his will to God, and he learned to depend on God. He learned to pray God's will. He learned to depend and wait on God. He learned to sit in God's will and patiently wait. Like David said, I patiently waited, and the Lord inclined his ear to me. How many times have we waited for God's presence and we've had to learn to wait, and we try to jump ahead of God's presence for us? Elijah's life teaches us how to pray God's will, how to depend on God, and how to wait on God. How many things did God use Elijah to do after his time alone in God's presence? I'm not saying that this is the one time that because Elijah even went and called down fire, and then he ran from Jezebel and he hid again, not under God's instructions. The first time that he hid was because the Lord told him, but the second time he didn't. But this is to show how human Elijah was. When we look at somebody's character like Elijah, we say, oh my God, this guy, the things that he did was so big that we could almost see him as a god. People could see other people as gods because and they learn to depend on what they're going to do to make the next move. But Elijah's life was just like anyone else's. He was human, even though God used him for big things. The Lord used him for big things after he learned what he needed to learn in God's presence. So this is the end of this theme for the month. I hope that you got something out of this message. It was short, as always. I'm always very short, but I hope that you got something out of this. There's a boot camp for all of us. There's a boot camp and a season for everyone that is following the Lord, that is trying to learn God's will, that is trying to learn how to wait and depend on the Lord. There's always a boot camp. And we can't lose courage, and um we can't lose ourselves and stop serving the Lord in the hard times. We have to face an enemy. The same way that Elijah faced Ahab and Jezebel, the worst kings in his time, we have to face an enemy. On a daily basis, we have to go through things that we have to prepare ourselves to face an enemy that's constantly challenging our lives, constantly trying us, constantly tempting us, constantly trying to distract our lives, constantly trying to attack us and trying to get us out of God's will. So if we look at somebody like Elijah's life, we learn to wait on God, and we learn to depend on him, and we wait on God's timing for our lives. So God bless all of you. I hope this brought something to your heart and something that you can get out of Elijah's life. God bless you and God keep you. And until next time, see you guys next Tuesday on our Spanish teaching, and next week on our English one with a whole new theme. Alone in his presence with this month, and next week will be a different theme. God bless you and God keep you.